Hello, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. And wherever you are in this wide, wonderful, beautiful world, you're listening to the Global Sales Leader Podcast. My name's Jason Cooper. I'm the sales relationship coach. The way I look at it and the way I work with people, it's all about that relationship. It's sometimes about the rapport, it's the connection. It's how we connect with the other person using and utilizing our people skills. Because at the end of the day, it's high levels of people skills, emotional intelligence, whatever you want to call it. But it's also being grounded within yourself so you can connect and radiate with the other person. So I got a wonderful guest today. It's Dr. Christopher Croner, PhD. So you are very welcome, Christopher, and I'm delighted to speak with you. I'm always interested in speaking to different people from different backgrounds. So you're very welcome.
Jason, thank you so much, sir. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I very much look forward to being of service to you and your audience.
Thank you. Like a bit of a synopsis about you, BA in psychology from DePaul University with a master's in PhD in clinical psychology and author, and I've read half of his book so far, but I'm going to read the rest of it. Never hire a bad salesperson again. So detailing lots of academic research in the background, and lots of your probably own research in there. And you also have an assessment psychology background as well. And look, there's lots of different facets. Rather than me talking about you, why don't you just talk about you and say, what got you in? You're obviously into psychology, but it's obviously understanding people. Sales is one of those things. So what prompted you to steer off in this direction?
Very, very good question. After I got my PhD, I joined a firm in the Chicago suburbs called Whitmer and Associates that specialized in executive assessment. So an executive assessment is an assessment that psychologists will sometimes do, industrial organizational psychologists will sometimes do when a company needs to hire, say, a new president, a new VP of sales, a new VP of HR, really to determine whether the person is going to have the leadership skills essential for that position. Really combines an interview process, for example, with job simulation, sometimes some assessments as well. That company wanted to design something as rigorous as that, a process as rigorous as that for salespeople, because of course sales is the lifeblood of any company, and if you're not selling anything, it doesn't matter who you have at the top, because you don't have that lifeblood, if you will. So they brought me on board to focus on that, to develop a process to assess whether someone would be an effective salesperson, involving a combination of an interview and psychological assessment, etc. So we really kind of spent a lot of time formulating that process. Did that for a few years. Met my co-author and business partner now, Richard Abraham, a few years thereafter in 2005. We wrote Never Hire a Bad Salesperson Again, the first edition of which was released in 2006. Started Sales Drive in 2005. Again, we have an online assessment that companies use to determine whether candidates have those non-teachable characteristics essential for success. We've been doing that since then. We worked at this point with, over 1,400 companies. Worldwide. And again, we're always happy to be of service, to discuss everything that we've learned and to be of service to anyone who has questions, for example, about what are the characteristics that lead to success in sales? What is it that differentiates the highest performers? It's my pleasure to discuss that at length with you today.
Okay, so straight into the question then. What are the characteristics of a phenomenal salesperson? Because I want to put this podcast today, it's always the point, and we discussed this before, is I want to give golden nuggets of knowledge, information. So when people listen to this podcast, and they do, is for them to take stuff away and go, I want to practice that. I want to learn that. That's really fascinating. So what makes the perfect salesperson? Number one, what's the behavior?
Yes, really three key characteristics. And the question we'll get before I even get into those is, how do you derive those characteristics?
Yeah, exactly.
Started out looking at, as I mentioned, 20 years ago, when I got my start doing this, looking at everything that had been published academically in terms of the world of academics. What is that leads to success as a salesperson? Everything that had been published over the last, Jason, 85, almost 90 years now, as well as looking at my own work, doing those behavioral interviews with sales candidates, and then circling back with their managers thereafter to find out who really does become successful, what traits. One question
before I jump in there, before you carry on any further. What was the top book that you found that was going, this is going to light the life off me? What was the one book that went, wow, this is incredible? Before we jump into the rest of it, because I just thought about it, I'm going to have to ask you the question.
Sure. So in terms of books that I read, in terms of background?
Yeah, in terms of background research, and what sort of really stood out as going, well, I can
Oh,
take the
yeah,
most
of
data
course.
from this.
Interestingly, the majority of what I had read, I would say that the books by McClelland, that talked about achievement striving were probably most important, but the majority of the research that we looked at academically was actually in the form of published studies. So published studies that would be published in academic journals.
Ah,
I guess there probably wasn't one really journal that stood out, if you will, because there are so many hundreds of them,
yeah,
if you
yeah,
will.
there are, yeah.
But I would say McClelland's books, where he talked about the origins of one of the first characteristics that we're going to be talking about in a minute, probably did stand out to me because they really kind of differentiated a topic and a characteristic that most people forget about, when they hire or interview a salesperson. They don't think about them. They think about, again, when you ask anyone what leads someone to be successful as a salesperson, they're typically going to give you very broad, generic answers. They'll scratch that and say, well, you want somebody, for example, who has good relationship skills, or they have the gift of gab, or they enjoy persuading people, things like that. But those are all teachable. Yes, those are all important. That's what we found. Those were all indeed very important.
Yeah.
But above and beyond any of those by far, as I mentioned, were these three non-teachable characteristics that continued to stand out and differentiate the highest performers, particularly, Jason, those whom we would describe as effective hunters. A hunter being a person who needs to go out and acquire new accounts. When you think about that person psychologically, someone who has to go out, knock on a door, if you will, sometimes in person, sometimes over the phone, but they're knocking on a door, sometimes in some cases getting that door slammed in their face, and then having to knock on the next door with that much more certainty and passion and conviction. Psychologically, that's a very special person that we're talking about. So the first key differentiator is what we call the need for achievement. I mentioned McClelland's books, the person, again, who wants to do well simply for the sake of doing well. So the person who's high in need for achievement, they just naturally want to set the bar high, if you will. They want to jump over that, and then they want to set it even higher again the next time. So they're constantly pursuing excellence simply for the sake of excellence. And it's interesting because the research shows that characteristic need for achievement. I'm sure you've seen it. It's important not only for salespeople, but also incidentally for entrepreneurs. People have to kind of wake up every morning and make it happen, and there's nobody standing over them watching them. So as you can imagine, as companies are now having to hire, in many cases, more and more remotely, we're finding that characteristic need for achievement just continues to become more and more important, because you don't always have the opportunity to stand over someone's shoulder all day long. You have to trust that they're going to be out there constantly focused on doing better and excelling their own expectations or exceeding their own expectations. So that's the first.
Christopher,
yes, sir.
Before you jump into the next part.
Of course.
So what goes into the mindset of the person? So he wakes up in the morning, he's on his own, he's remote. What goes on in his head? What does he say to himself? What does he talk to himself? Because it's all about self-dialogue. It's all about what you say and suggest to yourself, because we're all visualize stuff that goes on all the time. But we know from fight, flight, or freeze mechanism, we know that it's there to protect us. But what do we do, and how do we self-talk to ourselves? Because there's lots of self-sabotage going on all the time.
Very, very true. Very, very true. The person who is high in need for achievement is thinking about their previous goal, what they've accomplished in the past, and what they can do today. What step are they going to take today to take that performance to the next level? Now, the highest performers, we find, tend to have more of a system that they operate by. They don't get too caught up, typically staring at, say, the top of the ladder, as many trainers have described it. They don't necessarily stare at the top of the pyramid all day. They think about what is the next step. It's easier to think about what is the next step that you're going to take that particular day than to worry about everything, getting all the way to the top of the mountain, not worrying about the top of the mountain, just worrying about the next step. And they have a system that they typically will lay out for themselves every day, ideally the evening before, spending their time thinking about what are my top priorities, et cetera, the next day, doing their best to say, what concrete things am I going to do to pursue those priorities. When they have that written out and they have that plan for themselves, the next day, a lot of that, it's almost like writing an outline to a good paper when you're, in school to get a high mark, if you will. You're doing all of that work ahead of time, the hard thinking process in terms of, okay, what do I exactly need to do? Then when you wake up that morning, you're thinking, okay, what's the first step that I'm going to take to achieve that particular task? So all about thinking about the next step rather than the top of the mountain, because when you do it, when you break things down in that way, you're much more likely to succeed because you have a consistent pattern, a consistent process, if you will. So that's typically how they're focused on it.
There's a direct correlation between writing your goals down at night and putting pen to paper. And we know from research, and I've read a lot about this in research, is pen to paper. There's a connection, and you can see it and you can visualize it when you write your goals down. But when you do it at night, you dream about it, or hopefully you dream about it, as long as amongst other things that you dream about, but you dream about those. So you're more inclined to remember it for the next day. One of the other steps that I heard, and I read constantly, and it comes across, Think Rich, Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill says it 100 years ago when he interviewed all these phenomenal people back then, is to visualize things actually happening, but also visualizing your day in the right way. And that's probably what you suggested just before that. And it is, our brains are wired and fired to visualize things, and to maybe visualize things going well, and visualize your day, and maybe visualize a meeting, maybe visualize what you're going to do, but plan it in your head, or it's like a mental rehearsal.
Very, very true. Because when you do that process of visualization, you're giving yourself that first template. You're showing yourself, okay, here, this is exactly what I want to achieve in this moment. You know, breaking down moment by moment what you ideally want it to look like. Sort of like some of the great sales trainers have talked about when people show up at a client or at a prospect, when they're doing so in person, imagining or visualizing the red carpet being laid out, if you will. I've heard people describe that, but it's just that idea of sitting down and thinking about what you're going to do day to day and picturing things going ideally as you would like them to go. Because when you start to visualize things going as you would like them to go, you're going to set that template for your brain, if you will. You're going to solve the problems or the little nuances, if you will, that you might struggle with if you didn't take the time to visualize it. So you're essentially, at the end of the day, you're planning it. You're planning it in a much more intricate and exquisite way, if you will.
Yeah, and there is the planning that goes on inside. You construct the images well after you've written the goals down. And I recently watched Brian Tracy video quite recently again, and Zig Ziglar as well, and they both said that 30 years ago. Nothing's changed, but they both were saying it, and I'm going, wow, that I've just read a neuroscience book, and they've said exactly that 30 years ago. But they've studied success from a different era and a different way. But a lot of it is true, apart from the technology's all changed and all that. So yeah, I'm intrigued and fascinated by the behavior and the research that you've done in your assessments when you're actually with people. So what are the other behaviors and characteristics and attitudes?
Of course. The second is what we call competitiveness. And competitiveness is just that. It's really two things. The competitive salesperson, number one, they want to be the best in their team. They want to compare their performance to their peers because they just need to know how they stand. Think about here in the United States, Michael Jordan, the person who would almost let nothing get in the way of his competitive desire to succeed, if you will. And number two, they want to win that client or that customer over to their point of view. Because to them, psychologically, they see that sale in some ways as a bit like a contest of wills. So again, that's the two things they want to do. They want to be the best in their team, and they want to win that client or that prospect over to their point of view. And then the third element is optimism. And that is the salesperson's sense of certainty that they will succeed, as well as, of course, their resilience to hang in there when they face the inevitable rejection that a salesperson just has to deal with. When you think about that, when you think about, again, the first thing the person thinks about in the morning, it's not just that need for achievement. It's also the competitiveness and the optimism that they're putting together as they think about what they're going to be engaging in that day. The optimism, as you can imagine, is helpful as well to think about, okay, let's picture things going well. Let's picture the best thing that can possibly happen and sort of training that. Because again, optimistic salespeople we find consistently, if you look at Seligman's work consistently, sell 30% more than those that are lower in optimism. There's a reason for that. You know, they expect that things are going to go well. If I anticipate that the call is going to go well, that is going to impact the way that I get ready for it. It's going to impact my behavior during the call. It's going to impact what I think you're going to say to me as the prospect, for example, which is going to impact my comfort in responding to. All of those things come together. Need for achievement, competitiveness, and optimism psychologically to create what we call drive. And that's the challenge, that drive characteristic. As I mentioned, past the age of 21, 22, not much we can really do to change the salesperson's overall level of drive. It's kind of either it's there or it's not. And the research also shows, unfortunately, that drive, as you can probably imagine, is the easiest characteristic for a candidate to fake in the interview and the most difficult characteristic to accurately rate. So, of course, that's why we have our online assessment. That's what our clients use our online assessment for, to kind of suss out whether the person is going to, have those characteristics, if you will,
So
as well as,
what are the characteristics in your assessment that you can go, bang, got that? Obviously, there's other things that you can do after that within an interview to tell whether something's congruent or not. But what did you measure in the assessment tools? Because I've done lots of them. I've done countless number of them. So, but I'm intrigued by what you're studying and what you're seeing, and what are the results for that.
Sure. So a related question we'll sometimes get is, well, what does your assessment do to identify these characteristics? How do you pick them out? And again, when we created the drive test, the current version of the drive test several years ago, we wanted to make sure that we had, first of all, in the way that the questions were put together, we wanted to make sure we eliminated one of the problems that particularly affects, we find, some assessments of sales candidates. And that's that many times questions can be just a little bit too easy. For sales candidates, especially, as you can probably imagine, to size up the assessment, figure out what the questions are really looking for, and then just fake their way through it. So for example, if the question just said something like, I consider myself very persuasive, rate this from 1, not at all like you, to 5, exactly like you. Well, if you have a sales candidate who really wants that job, they're probably going to quickly determine for themselves, they want to declare themselves a 4 or a 5, if you will. Mm-hmm. So we use a question format that is designed specifically to eliminate faking, called forced choice. So for each question, the person gets a series of 3 statements. I'm sure you've seen these, and each statement is worded in a very positive way. So a question, for example, may say something like, I consider myself a leader. I have great relationship skills. I'm very organized. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, which of these is most like you and which one is least like you? So obviously that forces the candidate to make some very difficult distinctions, but then it gives us a much better sense of their real priorities. Yeah. And as they're working their way through the assessment, of course, we're constantly monitoring their consistency as they respond to those questions, because as you can imagine, if they do attempt to fake the test, it's going to be very difficult for them to remember consistently what they ranked most and least across the entire assessment. So again, it's designed to be very robust in that regard. And we're really looking at that drive piece, if you will. We're not measuring 50 different characteristics. We're really looking at that limited number: need for achievement, competitiveness, and optimism, and then a few more of the teachable characteristics as well. Things like, again, relationship skills, organizational skills, persuasion, confidence.
Yeah. So some of the elements of Dr. Robert Cialdini in there, in elements, by the sound of it, if you're looking for consistency, yes, which is obviously one of the key characteristics, likability, obviously trust and connection with other people, because again, people can fake it as well. Yes. But being persuasive is, I don't know, you can get the people out there, some people out there, that they think they're persuasive, but they're just annoying the living daylights out of the other person. So you don't want that, but you also want respect for the client. You also want to see it from their point of view, rather than going into that 1980s second-hand car dealership approach, you know, the one you're talking about. You go, I'm going to tell you that. That doesn't work anymore. And I don't think that ever really did, pushing people into a corner. But it's actually has a really smart guy who's a friend and mentor of mine, is to help people buy. Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. And it's all about really finding out what's most important to that person, what's most important to your prospect, and treating that as the crux of the conversation. You know, finding out how can you be of service to them. The word that I always use again and again: service, service, service. Focusing on service, everything else kind of happens naturally at that point. And you're exactly right. You know, when you look at persuasion, if someone is using improper techniques, or they're being in some ways way too aggressive, the benefit to looking at persuasion is, again, we can teach that. That's something that we can potentially improve. And if you have somebody who's high in need for achievement, for example, and they need to improve persuasion, that high need for achievement person is sort of like that kid in school that just has to get high marks. They have that mentality, if you will. So if they are doing something, as you can imagine, that's getting in their own way, you can stop them. You can show them, okay, here are a few things you're doing right, and here are a few things that are getting in your own way. Here's how you can make your performance even that much better. Here's how you can become even that much more powerful as a salesperson, and they will make that adjustment. That's why we emphasize that non-teachable piece so heavily.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's curiosity. Is you have to be curiosity, but you also have to have that passion. And you have to have that, make sure that that passion, that drive, that hunger is inside of you. Connect your passion to your purpose, to your dream. Another wonderful Zig Ziglar, and I keep that in my head, because you have to have the passion. You really have to have that passion and the drive. Like, you might be in an industry that you just keep falling over in, but then you go to another industry and you're absolutely flying. You go, well, what changed? Well, maybe it was the environment, maybe it's the culture, maybe it's the products that just was falling on its face, or maybe it's the leaders. But you jump onto another ship and then you're flying, because everything is around you there to support you. Everything's around there to make you grow and learn. And you go, well, this is where I'm going to fly, because I love what I do. and waking up every day, as we all know, and you love what you do, so I know I can hear it in your voice, the passion, the tone, the tonality. Mm-hmm. And that's part and parcel of it as well. Something I was going to say and suggest as we're talking is everything has to be congruent. What I mean by that is your voice, your tone, your tonality, but your body language has to be the same. Yes. What other studies did you find out after the assessment on the interview stages? Because that plays a big part as well, because we could all, what comes out of our mouth, which is depending on what sort of studies that you choose to read. I spoke with Joe Navarro the other day, the body language expert, and he was saying there was a study, 93%, which is 55%, which is body language. The next part is what comes out your mouth, your tone, and everything else is the questions that you ask and all of that. But that fluctuates, apparently.
And during the interview, if you do have the opportunity, of course, to be sitting with the person live, one-on-one, being able to monitor that candidate, keeping in mind, of course, that when the person first comes into the interview, they're going to be a little bit keyed up. That's natural. They're going to be a little bit nervous. So we always recommend giving that candidate a little bit of time to kind of calm down, maybe 5 minutes, just to kind of relax and kind of get their baseline back to their baseline behavior, if you will. Yeah. Get their blood pressure down. And then at that point, just kind of take the opportunity to kind of, again, do a little bit of small talk, and then work into the interview questions. We always recommend, again, if you haven't done so, work into the person's resume, et cetera. Then as you're doing so, just watch them and keep an eye on them as you're asking them questions. If, for example, the person suddenly turns red, that can be an indication that they're embarrassed, for example, obviously about whatever topic you're bringing up. Or if they start kind of looking to the side, looking down, looking up and to the left, sometimes you get, or looking up and to the right, they're searching for answers. I don't get
visual, auditory, and again, images, if it's done in the right direction. Yeah, I understand that.
Yes. Yes. And again, if the person is getting a little bit nervous, what I would tend to look out for is if the person is getting, excessively nervous, if they're responding in a very, very rapid fashion, for example, to a given question, or they tend to start for some reason toward the end of the interview, for example, they're stammering for some reason when they hadn't before, chances are you may have hit upon a sensitive subject, if you will. Now, if that sensitive subject is something, again, it's obviously focused on the world of work. If maybe you're asking them about a time when they had to learn a lot in a given task and what it was that was challenging for them, if they're responding in such a way that, again, they're stammering, oftentimes it indicates that they're a little bit nervous about that particular area. I'd want to think about, okay, is this an area that we can teach them? Is this something that we can help them develop in? If so, that's fine. They may be earlier in career. It's natural for them to feel that way. I'd rather bring somebody on board who is maybe just a little bit green and a little bit nervous, but who had that passion, than the other way around. The person who maybe, again, they may be very relaxed, but they maybe want to retire on the job. I don't necessarily want that person as my hunter, if you will. So I want to gauge body language, but I want to do so in a way that's congruent with my goals for that person and who they really are. Do they tend to be just a little bit more of a wound up type individual? That can be okay if we're able to dial it back, particularly if they have that need for achievement and we can show them how they can adjust their body language, because that's the most important thing too when we talk about listening skills. How are they adjusting their body language to deal with different types of prospects? Because chances are during the day, they're going to deal with many different types of people and they're going to have to adjust themselves to remain congruent with those people, if you will. So again,
so the balance between IQ and EQ.
Exactly.
What is the balance? Did you gauge on that? Because obviously you have to have an air of critical thinking. You have to have an air of resonating with the other person, but really understanding yourself and who you are. Because the more you can understand yourself, I think the more you can actually understand others and how others behave, because you already know yourself, you already know how you speak, and you already know what's going on in your head. So I think that high level of emotional intelligence, whatever you and however you package that emotional intelligence, but obviously you need intelligence as well. But what's the balance?
Good question. So that balance of IQ and EQ, if you will, really kind of depends, we find, on the position itself that we're hiring for. So for example, we may hire for a very complex sale or a less complex sale. If we're hiring for a less complex sale, something more the classic widget, if you will, oftentimes the person doesn't need quite as much IQ as, for example, if we're selling something that's very complex, say a complex solution sale in which the person needs strong problem solving skills, cognitive abilities, someone who really needs to be a very quick problem solver throughout the day. They need to have good analytical ability, and that sort of an individual, we need a little bit more of the higher IQ, and there are many assessments you can use that can be fairly quick. A 12-minute assessment, for example, there's a great one out there kind of that looks at that intellectual ability, that horsepower, if you will. On the EQ side, we find that no matter what, EQ is important. The IQ we can adjust a little bit. EQ is important no matter what, because with EQ, we're always looking at is this person going to, as you mentioned, remain congruent with their prospect? Are they going to be the sort of individual that's going to focus on what they can really do to be of service to that prospect? And the person high in EQ is able to not only do that, but also adjust their behavior during the conversation. If they know that something has changed in that prospect or that client's demeanor, they're going to be able to adjust themselves to be congruent with that person. And when you feel that someone is congruent with you or they're resonating with you, you're much more likely to kind of nod, if you will.
Like I'm doing now.
Yeah, and again, you're much more likely to have a strong relationship with that person, because that's just human nature, if you will. So I'd say EQ is important no matter what. The IQ we can kind of adjust. There are some situations, as you can imagine, where the solution or the sale is a more complex solution sale, which we need a little bit more IQ. Sometimes it's not as complex. Even in that situation, if it's not as complex and the IQ is too high, they can come across as an egghead. We don't necessarily want that. Sometimes we get to dial it down a little bit in terms of what we're really looking for. But EQ is always important. We don't measure EQ with our assessment simply because we wanted to keep it under control in terms of length. But there are many great assessments out there that look at EQ. I studied that a bit during my internship. I remember before I got my doctorate. EQ is a fantastic, fantastic.
What about also ageism in the marketplace for sales professionals? Because there is ageism out there. Because there are these wonderful tech companies out there, and they hire the best and they hire that. But sometimes there's other people out there, and there is ageism in the marketplace. What do you notice if you studied people that are slightly older, and then you bring out an assessment in them? What have you brought out in that?
That's a good question. We actually, of course, when we designed our assessment, we wanted to make sure that it adhered to the guidelines we have here in the United States, the EEOC, to make sure that there was no discrimination based upon age.
But there is.
You know, in terms of the assessment itself, we wanted to make sure that people weren't scoring differently, as you can imagine, just because they were older. And we found that with the assessment, we weren't having any of that sort of bias with the assessment itself. However, we do see, of course, when companies are hiring, there can be that predilection oftentimes for a younger company. They want people who they feel are going to be congruent with them. They think that, okay, to do so, we're going to need people who are younger. That's not necessarily true at all. What you really want to look for is the person's background. Do they have the ideal background you want? And again, do they have those personality characteristics? We see sometimes people later in career still have that very high need for achievement. They're very competitive. They're very optimistic. They can certainly do quite well for you. It's really just about determining whether the person has both the right background and the right drive to be the ideal sort of person for that particular role. So for example, sometimes companies will say, well, we want somebody who's going to come on board and they're going to hit the ground running. We want them to start producing relatively quickly. What should we look for? Well, we want to look for somebody who's, they may say somebody who's a little bit earlier in career, but maybe has had success at a very large company. Surely they'll bring that same degree of success to bear for us. And I will tell them, watch out. You want to find somebody, particularly if you're a younger company, and you're looking for somebody who's going to start producing quickly for you. You want to find somebody who, again, has some experience in a similar situation. So maybe they've had 2 to 3 years, or maybe even more, of relevant experience. And here's the key: at a similarly sized company, as well as a higher drive score. Because again, if you get the person who's been successful at the very large company, oftentimes it's tempting to say, okay, this person's been successful at this very large company. Surely they've had world-class sales training. Surely they'll bring that same degree of success to bear for us. But the key question is, what really led to their success? Was it always their own effort, or was it really the fact that they had all that brand recognition, collateral material, they're helping them out? So again, you can certainly find people who are later in career who can be quite successful, particularly if they have the background that you're ideally looking for in terms of previous experience. And then they have that passion, if you will, those non-teachable characteristics, so that when you do put them in that role, they can hit the ground running, they can start filling their pipeline relatively quickly. Age doesn't have anything to do with what really leads someone to be successful as a salesperson. You can have somebody who's later in career, someone early in career. They can all be successful if they have, again, the right pieces and you put them in the right situation at the right time.
Good. I like that answer. That was very good, very concise, very succinct. So what haven't I actually asked you yet? So if you were interviewing yourself, what sort of question would you ask yourself right now?
I would probably ask myself, what do you know now at this point in your career, Dr. Croner, that you most perhaps wish you knew when you got started? You know, something like that, that really causes the person to go, huh? That's often a question I'll recommend when I'll talk to students when they're interviewing for their first job. It's a great question to ask someone in that situation, because it really requires you to think. And if you were to ask me that, I might say, well, I probably most wish that I knew how sometimes different people react to the concept of hiring a high drive salesperson. I think that would probably be the most interesting thing that I probably could have found out at the beginning. For example, you can get individuals that think that they have a golden gut, if you will, that they don't need any sort of an assessment. They don't need a streamlined process. They can just sit with the candidate and just kind of kind of get a good feel for how the person's going to perform. And they just know they don't need any extra help.
Yeah.
Oftentimes that person can take a little bit of while to come around to the idea that, well, again, having a gut instinct is important. That's certainly important, for example, looking at something like, say, cultural fit, but it's not always going to be the most reliable indicator whether the person is going to succeed for you as a salesperson. Instead, having a step-by-step consistent process, starting out with, for example, a resume review. And what do you look for in a resume? We always talk about that. A phone screen, for example. What do you ask in a phone screen? We talk about that. Moving on to an online assessment. What questions do we use? How do we assess those characteristics? And then moving the person into the one-on-one interview, combining all of those steps and looking consistently at all of the elements of what we might think of as the sales ecosystem. So not only personality, but also, as you can imagine, fit with the company culture, fit with the management style, fit with the compensation plan. All those things come together like an athlete at the end of the day to ultimately determine how successful that person will be. In this case, again, we're looking at, when it comes to personality, we're kind of looking at raw athletic ability. How fast can they run? How high can they jump? But at the end of the day, all of those things come into play as well. So it's about teaching companies to understand that all the elements of that system are important and giving them a consistent process. I talked about system before, a consistent process they can use every single time to assess candidates, making sure the experience is fair and helpful for every single candidate.
There's a question in there, actually. I'm reading a book at the moment. Well, it's an Audible book, but it's all about sports psychology. And he was speaking about a rugby match between New Zealand and France, and it was the finals, but the World Cup was actually happening. But the New Zealanders were just going down and down and down, but they're so aggressive as a team. They were saying one of the guys was just out and out and out, but everyone was aiming in for him. But he had such power, such cohesiveness, such drive. Like, he got knocked out literally, and he was just like, he didn't know where he was, but he still got up. Then he got hit in the head and he had blood rushing down and had a big gus coming down there. But he said, no, I still have to go. I've got 3 points, and the French team had 20 points or something like that. But he still got up there, and he got actually hit somewhere really badly. And it wasn't until the end of the game, and he was still up out there because other people were being sent off, and finished the end of the map, and he was just about to go and just get watched down and all that. But he had such a large cut, and he had blood coming off him and flesh hanging off him. But that, to me, on sports and sales, is that just whatever happens, I'm still going to do it. I'm still going to drive through. And there's a direct, as we know, and you obviously know very well, there's a direct correlation between elite sports people and salespeople and entrepreneurs with that drive and passion and know-how. And that area is just, if you have that, I think that's the top of the top, where you just don't feel it, see it, but you just go for it. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, the human spirit's an amazing thing, isn't it? And really, when you can exemplify something like that for the rest of the team, you're setting an example at the same time that you're doing that, and that changes their mind in terms of what's possible. You know, it changes their mindset at that same time in terms of, okay, what can I do now? This person is willing to do this. What am I willing to do? And you're exactly right. You see a lot of that in common amongst athletes and salespeople and entrepreneurs. Now, a key distinction is that many companies will say to us, well, that's what we really look for. We want someone who was a former athlete, and that's good enough. I'll tell them, no, you don't. That's not good enough, because if the person has been a former athlete, that's wonderful, fantastic. But I want to find out, for example, what really led to their success. Was it someone who was, say, for example, a great college athlete, but they needed a coach every morning to call them to get them out of bed? I ideally would like to look for someone who was successful as an athlete. Of course, that can be great, but also the person who was out in the field at 6:30 every morning before everybody else. That mentality, if you will.
David Beckham's of the world.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're talking about. Now, again, the person might not have an athletic background, and that's fine too. Someone who ready to work to put themselves through school, that's great. But always finding out what really contributes to that person's need for achievement, competitiveness, and optimism. Because a person can be competitive in many different ways. They don't have to be in sports. That's a great outlet for it, but there can be many different fields of endeavor or areas of their life in which they've been competitive, and we always allow for those as well.
Yeah, no, I completely concur with that. And I think there's other elements in there, and we could probably carry on this discussion forever and a day. Obviously, being coachable, knowing and giving, having feedback, them opening up and going, okay, well, how can I adjust what I've done, and how can I change if something's not gone in the right direction, and so on and so forth. There are lots and lots of topics, and I'm fascinated with this. Christopher, how can people find out more about what you do? Obviously, your book, and we've spoken about your book, which is absolutely phenomenal. But how can people find out more about you?
Thank you. They can go to salesdrive.info, and there for any of your listeners who are, for example, sales managers, they'll have the opportunity to do a sample drive test. We offer one complimentary assessment. There's a big button at salesdrive.info, as well as if any of your listeners would be interested in learning more about our partner program, our partnering with us, we have information on our website as well.
Awesome. Christopher, that was absolutely fantastic. I've thoroughly enjoyed that conversation today. And there's so much golden nuggets all along the way. And I'm sure this is 100% value for anyone that's listening to this. And I know they're going to get some stuff out of this, some golden gems I have. And I love the conversation as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jason. Very much enjoyed being here. And again, enjoyed the opportunity to be of service.
Thank you. You've listened to the Global Sales Leader podcast. Every week, I speak to phenomenal people, phenomenal guests, where we can learn and grow together, where we can actually have the mindset, and help give value forward to all of our clients and our potential clients. So thank you so much.